It's very easy to think, oh, well, China is that thing over there. But actually, once you get there and you start to understand the differences in how consumers are relating to cars, it opens up vastly more opportunities to do interesting stuff. It is probably the most interesting market to design for.
Hello, I'm Joe Simpson.
And I'm Drew Smith.
And welcome to Looking Out the Podcast, auditory side to the newsletter, in which we connect the dots across mobility, design and culture.
And coming up in this, our 12th episode of Looking Out the Podcast, Joe is going to be a tour guide. He's going to walk us down the street of Shanghai, aren't you? Looks like Shanghai.
It is Shanghai, well observed.
Tell us a little bit about the trip, Joe. What's going on?
Yeah, so I'm here in Shanghai for a few days. It's my first time in China since 2017. There's obviously been a global pandemic in between that time. And I think it's fascinating to just go for a bit of a walk through Shanghai, the car park here and what's going on, because obviously Shanghai and China generally is a very fast-moving, fast-changing place. But as we've observed in a few of the podcasts, the last few episodes, I think earlier this year at the Shanghai Auto Show, it was a really big shock for a lot of Western auto execs when they walked onto that show floor and saw the progress that is being made by the local brands.
Why don't you take us for a walk down a street in central Shanghai? Last time I was there in 2019, so just prior to the pandemic breaking out. I'm just really curious to hear your observations around how the city has changed in that time and what you're now seeing on the street. Because obviously China is a bit of an obsession for the auto industry. It has been the golden goose for Western manufacturers, certainly European manufacturers for a number of years. That dynamic is starting to shift quite dramatically. And I think the reliance of Western manufacturers on China as a market is starting to come unstuck a little bit. So
right.
What is the evidence that you can see on the street there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that careful to not conflate Shanghai with China. I'm only going to give you observations on Shanghai here. I haven't been to any other parts of China since 2016. And I think there's a mistake that a lot of Westerners make, which is that they go to a place in China and they think that is China. And China's obviously 16 provinces. It's a hugely diverse place. I've been to Beijing quite a bit too, and just the difference between Beijing and Shanghai is quite stark. So let's talk about this as a kind of Shanghai perspective, which is maybe a bit like a kind of a London compared to the rest of the UK. It's not the same place. Nonetheless, change here, wow, it's really moving at a rip-roaring pace. Obviously, you can see the skyline behind me. There are simply skyscrapers for as far as I can see. And the other thing to note about that is that I can actually see quite a long way. So I think that's one of the main things that I observed from the last time I was here. The last time I was here, you could taste the air.
I was going to say, I remember getting out of the airport and on top of the kerosene, there was a metallic tang that did not leave my mouth the entire time. And you could see it. And I'm looking at the skyline behind you and it seems remarkably clear.
And I think we've got lucky with the weather on this trip, I have to say. And it's November, so it's probably a kind of a fortuitous time of year. But nonetheless, I think there has been a huge change in a lot of the contributors to that kind of pollution and that taste and that sort of smell we both experienced was a lot of the scooters, two-stroke scooters, a lot of the cars and a lot of the kind of heavy trucks and things. Now, I think that has changed. All of the scooters now are electric, and at various times of the week, various times of the day, heavy trucks are not allowed into central Shanghai. They have to go around the edge. A lot of the buses are now on either a trolley wire system or electric. But I think one of the main differences is the cars. And I think people who know a bit about China will know there's this kind of green plate system. You have to buy a number plate to buy and own a car here. And if you want to buy a regular kind of gasoline-powered car, the number plates, if you don't already own one, are very expensive to get hold of. But if you buy a so-called new energy vehicle, you can have a green plate at a much cheaper cost. And what strikes me walking down the street here is just the number of green plate cars there are. It feels like every other car has a green plate on it, which means it's either fully electric or it's basically a long-range hybrid, what we might call a range extender hybrid, where there's a very big battery in it, so most of the time it's running on electricity.
Now, the last time I was in Shanghai, electrification of the vehicle fleet was certainly starting to take hold, but it felt by and large like it was still, like an EV was still a premium proposition. And one of the things that I'm curious about is, are we starting to see mid-market and entry-level vehicles proliferate on the streets of Shanghai?
Oh, God, yes.
Talk us through that a bit.
I would actually say I wonder whether that's flipped a little bit, whereby...
Really?
I actually, and this is just an anecdotal observation, I haven't checked the data, but I haven't seen leagues of, let's say, BMW iXs or Mercedes EQEs and EQSs. In fact, I don't think I've seen a single Mercedes EQ model that I can think of here.
It's a bit like America then.
And what's interesting is that there's still a car park of those, as they call it in China, ABB, Audi, Benz, BMW. There's still a car park that's of those cars. They seem to be predominantly like petrol, and actually here more high-end. It's more of your M4s and your C63 AMGs and your E-Class coupes and things like that. So that leaves us with everybody else. And then, it's very much the mid-market and even the lower market, which seems to be electrifying. And if you've not ever been to China, Shanghai before, your typical streetscape, you will be absolutely, as a car person, enthralled to brands that you just don't recognize, that you just don't see yet in Europe, or certainly not in America. And it's extremely diverse. And my main reflection from not coming here for 6 years is that car park now, to my eyes, is predominantly Chinese brands, predominantly startup brands, many of them brands that weren't here a few years ago. And there's less of the kind of Western brands. The number of Volkswagens, who are a huge brand in China, seems to have gone down massively. As I say, it's anecdotal, just central Shanghai, but it does seem to be a vast change.
Before we get into the Chinese brands, I want to stay on the street for a second, because one of the things that I picked up on last time I was in Shanghai, and it was a reinforcement of a bunch of stuff that I'd been reading about in the micromobility space, is that beyond the electrification of the moped or the scooter, I did notice that there was what gets referred to in the world of micromobility as this Cambrian explosion of different types of sub-car vehicle. And I'm curious to know how that has evolved and how the streetscape sort of works between your traditional sort of car. And because before the car came along, China was a country that ran on the bicycle. Right? And it feels like there was a moment, if you're a micromobility devotee, where you put your head in your hands and you think, oh God, like you actually had it, but now you've gone to the car. Like, how does the balance now play out on the street in Shanghai?
And this is interesting because we actually went for a 20-kilometer bike ride around Shanghai yesterday, which is, as some people might say, is taking your life in your hands. I actually found it much more sanitized and easygoing than I expected. There was only one life or death moment. My colleague nearly got taken by a bus. But, I think the Cambrian explosion of different vehicle types maybe hasn't happened so much. Push bikes, pedal bikes, that's a huge thing. I think what's interesting is the traffic here is so bad. It's like a kind of like Chinese LA, that actually the quickest way to get around the center of this city now is on a bike. There's the moped scooters, a typical sort of electric moped kind of Vespa type vehicle. What was interesting to me, or what's interesting, I think, to us as designers, is the amount of customization you get on that. The amount of people with like fairings, with kind of almost duvets or quilts that they could put their hands in to keep them warm. But then the most interesting ones are probably the kind of almost like the trikes, which I
Yeah.
think have been very much you've seen if you've been to China for a long time, where there's a kind of like a box on the back and various different things being carried. And then, of course, I think the thing that's exploded since the last time I was here was the kind of world of food delivery and online delivery. And really, if you're riding a bike around the city, the riders you've got to watch are the Meituan food delivery riders, who literally will take their life into their own hands and squeeze through gaps you would not try and make any attempt to get through yourself, and really are taking no prisoners. But they're getting food from any part of the centre of the city to any other part in about 20 minutes, guaranteed. And they were apparently the lifeblood of the city during lockdown. Really, there's still that huge population of bikes and scooters, but not so much the kind of diversity of micro vehicles that you perhaps might have expected here if you'd come here 2015, 2016.
All right. Well, on the topic of diversity, you have taken a trip to a car retail mall. Walk us through that experience.
So car retail is a fascinating space. I think we should actually do a future episode dedicated to it, because different brands have different approaches, different countries have got different things. What I went to on Friday was this kind of mall, which is, it's a kind of a high-end shopping mall, but on one floor of it, it's almost, I would say, dedicated brand spaces that are... I'm trying to describe it to people so they might be able to get it if they've not been here before. But the way that, I suppose, brands like Polestar have taken spaces in places like the UK, in places like Sweden, in places like the Netherlands, in shopping centres or shopping districts. And it's like a store. So stores that are pretty much like a kind of mini Apple store in the shopping centre. They typically have maybe 2 or 3 cars in it rather than that array of 10 vehicles. Quite small spaces. And then they have a few brand advocates hanging around, dressed out in the corporate gear, but with a very light touch, not trying to hard sell you, just there to support and demonstrate things to you. And then varying degrees of quite nicely branded up sort of spaces and a wider experience which extends beyond the car. And I think the one to really highlight here, which people might be aware of because it's come to Europe or come to certain markets in Europe, is Neo.
I was going to say,
Neo's houses. Neo taking on, at least to my eyes, a very Scandinavian aesthetic, very pared down, very minimal, a lot of white, a lot of wood. But the most interesting thing about Neo is that their houses are almost experience centres. So there's as much space in the one we went to in this mall dedicated to the coffee shop as there is to the cars. And the coffee shop is actually only accessible to people who own a Neo, or if you're planning to buy a Neo. And what was interesting to me was that this mall, which definitely wasn't central Shanghai, was a good hour's drive out of the centre, quite full on a Friday afternoon of Neo owners sat entertaining their kids, getting bubble tea, having actually very high quality flat white, people working, people taking phone calls, people using it as a kind of rest stop while they're obviously doing their other shopping. And I think this is the thing, they're building experiences that move far beyond the car and are very much about a community of owners and the value that can deliver.
I find this fascinating because in the West, if I think about my experience of brand spaces, say Tesla in Sydney, when they used to be on Martin Place, the Polestar spaces, Neo's space in Gothenburg, they feel a little bit desperate in a way. Mm-hmm. You can tell that there is this desire to open the brand up and to invite people in to experience it. But very rarely, if ever, have I seen those spaces being used the way the design teams intended them to be used. And as a result, they just feel like small showrooms of the old school. Or at the other extreme, you get the Bentley experiences or the Aston Martin experiences, which go so far over the top in trying to express Bentleyness or Aston Martinness that it all feels a bit sort of fur coat, no knickers.
I wonder if there's a mental modeling thing here. Like, I know there are traditional car dealers in Shanghai and in China, but I wonder whether there's a thing for us in the West and in Europe where any of those spaces, you immediately like, that's cars, that's a car dealer, ugh, I'm going to be sold at. Or some of them, the spaces feel so almost art gallery-like that you feel trepidation about actually going in. Like, to go in, like, I have this in Gothenburg where I'm like, oh, God, if I take my kids in there, they're going to wreck something. So I won't go in. Here, I think there was a lot more, what I observed, chilled out approach. We went to Hi-Fi's store. Hi-Fi is this Human Horizons, but the basically the cars, the Hi-Fi X, the Hi-Fi Y, and the Hi-Fi Z. If you don't know this brand, by the way, check it out. It's wild, the things that they are doing, design and technology-wise. But a very small store. It felt more like one of those mobile phone stores. There were people just hanging around, and there was this thing where I was like, are you a hi-fi person, or are you just a member of the public? And it was just a member of the public sat on a phone while her son was like in the car playing with the tech, looking at things. And there was just like really chilled out, the kind of guys in there who were the brand ambassadors or whatever they're called, just don't care. They're fine. Happy to give you information, happy to help, happy to show you how things are, but not like getting a don't touch that
but no pressure.
Exactly. I think there's something else, though, here around the community of owners and how people have... I don't really know why and how this has happened, but it's an interesting one to contemplate and dig into, how people have taken brands to their heart, become kind of brand advocates. There's this whole world that sits around it in the digital space, the world on WeChat and Bilibili, which is like the kind of Chinese YouTube, where people are either sharing their experience, advocating for the brand, saying what a great time they've had. And apparently I think this is what Neo owners do. There's a kind of crowdsourced kind of information, which in Neo's case is now going back into the cars. So when you talk about something like charging, or you talk about something like parking, people being able to say, yeah, there's always charging available here, or there's always parking available here. And the infotainment systems sucking in that sort of wisdom of crowds knowledge, so that people are like, okay, this one will be better than that one. I talked to one of our colleagues yesterday who said, yeah, we've got a friend who's really advocating for the brand Zeekr. And they bought a Zeekr 001 when that arrived, and they've now bought the recently launched Zeekr 009 and the Zeekr X. And they're doing and going to events at the weekend for free, advocating for Zeekr and trying to, if you like, sell or show off the benefits of the cars. And just to come back to the street briefly, the most interesting thing that happened yesterday was when we rented the bikes, we went to this little boutique bike shop in the French concession. And when we arrived outside, there was a Neo ET5 Touring, so Neo's new station wagon version of the ET5. Trunk lid open, Brompton folded up on the inside. And when we went in, we were not accosted, but I thought that the person who turned out to be a Neo advocate was actually the person from the bike shop giving me the bike. And she was like, oh, just scan this code. And then she gave me a Neo mug. And then she was like, oh, the WeChat scan code couldn't take my phone number because I don't have a Chinese phone number. And she was like, oh, no, I can't send you the information. And I was, do you want to test drive the car? And I was like, I'm not allowed to drive here. I'm from the West. But it was basically this kind of, as my colleague described, like these flash mobs appear in places. The brands are like, that's a space, that's a store, that's a location where we should be seen. And then doing kind of ad hoc marketing, brand building, flash mobbing around that brand and taking people and getting them to drive the cars or getting their information. This stuff is fascinating. And it was an absolute dead hit in terms of that brand, that car, that store, that location. It was a very good match.
I find that absolutely fascinating because outside of perhaps Tesla, the only time you see this sort of advocacy for brands tends to be at like classic car meets.
Right. It's back to the old men with beards.
It's
situation.
People turning up with the greatest hits and people coalescing around what was, rather than what is.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating to me.
It is fascinating because here, if you think about it, there isn't really that 100 years history and culture that sits around the car. I think there's a fundamentally different relationship with the car. I think in the West, we have this idea, particularly as men, of this idea of mastering the car, being a great driver. The car is my servant and I will master it and become an amazing wheelsmith. And I just don't think
Behold my stringbacks.
Okay. Oh. And there's just none of that BS here. But what there is a car park which is very modern, very new, very difficult, borderline illegal to own a classic car here. The test process to actually keep a really old car on the road, very stringent. Ironically, the oldest things I think I've seen here, I've seen 2 Ferrari 458s. And I was like, oh, how old is a 458 these days? I was like, that must be knocking on for 10 years old. I was like, oh, that's actually that's literally like the oldest thing. Wow. So I think you've got people then actually advocating for modern brands, the tech and the brand and the wildness of the design is something they actually really buy into, that's really making their life better. And it's really interesting to see that, because I tend to think we've got a bit like all modern cars are rubbish in Europe and the US, and I think genuinely there's not that sense here. It's a completely different attitude and different relationship to car, actually, and there's a real newfound pride in these new energy Chinese brands, and that's, I think, the other thing that's driving the growth of those and that becoming the mainstay of the car park here.
I bet if those legacy automakers could bottle that up, they'd be very pleased. I want to get into the cars themselves now, because something that we've talked about a lot in looking out is how there is a fundamentally different approach to how cars are put together at a conceptual level, and the role that technology plays.
Yeah.
Which is very different from how we see Western legacy automakers creating new energy vehicles.
Yeah.
So talk us through that.
A few things on this one. First of all, I think what's fascinating is that the Chinese are still very much into sedans. So the thing I observe here, which is actually quite a shock to my European eyes, is that there seem to be far fewer SUVs in Shanghai than there are in my hometown now, as it is of Gothenburg. So the dominant vehicle on the road is still the sedan or the fastback or the kind of the low car, broadly. I think then the other thing that you see is just this variety of form factor, variety of form language, the boldness of execution. I would observe that the main difference between when I was here last time and when I'm here now is that last time you still could see cars where it felt like this brand, this team really have never designed a car before. There's just stuff that is fundamentally mistakes, looks terrible, everything's off. Now, clearly understood car design, clearly get it, and it's that quote of almost like Chris Bangle, understood car design, understood what the rules are. Now once you've understood those, you can go and break them with knowledge. And that's why you're getting this kind of diversity and actually quite striking visual expressions.
So make this concrete for us. Give us some examples of how this new approach to form factor, this new approach to surface or graphics or whatever might be playing out. What are the most striking examples?
So let's talk about the Avatars, fairly new brand. It's a brand that is now I'm going to get these wrong, but I think it's a joint collaboration between Chang'an and I think it's either Huawei or Foxconn that are involved. But these feel very high end. The SUV feels a bit like a really good version of the Aston Martin SUV. What's it called again?
The DBX.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yep.
It's got this really fascinating rear end where it's got almost like a flat upright rear screen, and then the C-pillars come out like a pair of flying buttresses, and then there's a kind of deck lid. So it's almost like Jaguar XJS-esque. And then
Can't go wrong with an XJS.
Really bold just full width signature, which kind of then emphasizes the deck lid. And then a really bold C-shaped graphic, super slim C-shaped graphic DRL, but actually really, really nicely done form language. And then their 12, which is their newly launched sort of fastback, again, feels a bit like maybe a modern take on the Aston Martin Rapide. Like the Polestar 4, no rear window. So the rear window's gone, even though it's fastback. So you have this very large trunk, which is self-contained, but then you have a fastback form. And the exteriors are really nicely executed. The interiors are wild. It's like being in a disco. Just the way that the door cards are treated, the way that the speaker system is integrated into the IP with this kind of central column and floating elements. And then, I'd forgotten, on the outside, they have visual displays. So at the bottom of the cowl or the top of the hood, there's a visual display which shows you, the car is charging, or I'm parking here, or please go ahead, and things like that. Same on the Hi-Fis. They have customizable front and side displays in the case of the Z. We'll post in the video like one of it strobing my name along the side. And stuff like this is cheesy to us, but they're just moving at such a rapidly fast rate and bringing the cost of technology down. They're going, why not? Bring this stuff in.
I saw a video the other day of the new Zeekr 007, and it has this LED
full width
eyebrow stretched across the front of the car, probably with a few thousand LEDs in it that can display dynamic graphics. And I'm just like, to a Western designer's and design strategist's mind, I'm just like, why?
Yeah. I know. There is always a bit of a why question here. I think one of the interesting things to reflect on is the way that, again, the digital world and the influencers on TikTok and within WeChat forums on Bilibili are looking at these cars, and how it's interesting to reflect for us as strategists how trends evolve, where apparently they're walking through new cars and saying, and it's got an exterior display, and it's got a deployable rear spoiler, and it uses X-cells and LEDs in this area, and the door is openable via the phone or touch openable. All the doors on these things are basically self-opening, and then you just grab it or wave it and it closes. And this is driving a kind of trend in the higher end of these vehicles of expectation of technology-based convenience, technology-based sort of expression, that I think then all the brands are moving and reacting to, and there's becoming this level of hygiene factor of things you need to qualify. Now, as you say, we can question why, and you can say, and you can use some of these things and say, is it genuinely better than just pulling a door handle? Arguably, no. But as you and I know, Drew, some of these things take hold, and then they become things that customers get an expectation of their next car having. And then if you don't have them, you're not on the shopping list, or you're perceived as old, or you're perceived as not at the races.
And it's reminding me of my days working in the Apple retail channel. So when I was at university studying industrial design, I worked in an Apple reseller. This was in the days before Apple stores, the in-house Apple stores existed. And back in those days, as a brand, Apple could not sell on a spec sheet.
No.
And we were trained to sell on stories. We were trained to sell essentially through fostering community around creative output.
Yeah.
And a little bit like the brand stores you described, people would come in and just hang out. We would run training seminars, and it was totally fine for people to just hang out and do their work and chat about the product. Whereas PCs in those days, and I think to a large extent still are, they're sold on a spec sheet. And what we're seeing here, what you're describing is there is absolutely this brand experience element to all of this sense of community and the sense of belonging. Yet so much of the development of the product is being driven by, does it have an exterior display on its spec sheet? Can I pump the brake pedal and have the doors close? There's this sort of this is it neophilia? This like always driving for something new.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think this is where it becomes a 1-2 knockout punch for some of the Western or legacy OEMs. You've got both. So you've got this spec sheet led speed of development, which I don't think many legacy brands can keep up with. Because the other thing is they've got R&D teams who are clearly like with this can do, oh, you want to do that freaking mental thing? Yeah, let's try it. We'll try and develop that in a handful of months, and we can find a sort of local supplier who can do it at next to no cost. But then you've got this kind of brand building world in the malls, this advocacy happening online. And yes, I know there are brands from the West who have done this. BMW have done it quite successfully here in some spaces. But really, it's this kind of incredible sort of two-step brand plus spec sheet thing, which is, I think, is really driving these brands forward. I think the other thing is price. So
because here's the thing, like a lot of this technology, you look at it and you think, Christ on a bike, this is going to be expensive.
So I think for either of us as strategists and people who've worked in the industry, you're like, okay, what's happening here? How are you able to get this level of content in? How are you able to spend this money on these spaces in really expensive real estate locations with all these people and staff and the experience you're giving customers, and then sell the car for below 300,000 RMB, which is about, let's have a look. I think it's 300,000 RMB is maybe sort of 40,000 euros. So just for people who don't know, Drew, I think it's worth talking about how much some things cost here. So if we look at the Tesla Model 3 Highland, Tesla is still very popular here. New Model 3 Highland is about 265,000 RMB. That equates to about 33,000 euros. Now, that car in Germany starts at 42,000 euros. So you say, okay, that's not miles off, but it's a bit cheaper. But then you talk about something like a Volkswagen ID3. Now, Volkswagen have been, I think it's fair to say, hit a bit by the price bloodbath and by perhaps a somewhat lack of popularity of the ID models here. So just recently, you've been able to buy an ID3, a fairly high-spec ID3, it should be said, for 120,000 RMB. That's 15,000 euros.
Wow.
In Germany, the ID3 starts at 39,000 euros.
They're not making any money on that, are they?
I don't think they are. They're actually selling quite a few now at that price. Surprisingly. The new Zeekr X, which is their kind of small SUV, sister car to the Smart #1 and the Volvo EX30. Lot of content in that car. The screen that moves to the side, a zero-gravity passenger seat, Yamaha stereo,
and a level of fit and finish, at least from the images and the videos that I've seen, which is just wild.
Yeah.
Like just extremely high level of interior and exterior fit and finish.
It's very well done, and it's 189,000 RMB here. So that's 24,000 euros. That car starts at 40,000 euros in the Netherlands. Even a Neo ES6, which is like, EC6, which is like a big BMW X3 and is fully electric, it's 330,000 RMB. That's 43,000 euros. Now, you're looking at paying above 60,000 euros for an electric iX3 in Europe. And it does not have the level of content, and it does not have the level of ecosystem and infrastructure that sits around a Neo here, because you've got things like battery swap stations, you've got chargers everywhere, and you've got that kind of Neo
You've
house
got a
experience.
cafe.
Exactly, where you can get a damn good flat white and your online community. So I think the other thing is that the price level is another factor in driving the popularity. If you lived here, it's like what you would not buy one of these cars for your green plate, and probably not buy it from one of these brands.
Because I'm looking at those prices, and the question that's running through my mind is how, first of all, how is it sustainable for Western manufacturers to be operating in that market? But also, longer term, How is it sustainable for these Chinese startups?
I don't necessarily have complete answers to those questions. I think for premium brands like Mercedes, Audi, and BMW, and certainly Mercedes and BMW, I think there's probably, ironically and paradoxically, a lot of logic around them continuing their internal combustion business here. It's notable here how when you see something like Mercedes E63 AMG or a BMW M4 being driven in Europe, it always seems to be driven by, and I'm going to be an awful stereotype here, a fat, balding, older guy who you probably don't want to have any kind of interaction with in a negative way, because they've probably got a baseball bat in the boot. Here, cycling around yesterday, yeah, all the M4s, all the E60, C63 AMGs being driven by 20-year-olds who look exceptionally cool, dressed in extremely cool kind of clothes. It's obviously a bit of a fashion parade. It's obviously a look, a thing, a signifier. And I think there's as well this kind of an older sort of group of people who I think for those brands, it is still premium. What I don't see is much EV in that space, as I said. It's all of the kind of more high-end luxury or performance-orientated stuff. So I think to some extent those brands can sustain in that space. I don't think the Chinese brands can really play in that space at the moment. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. But obviously that's not the kind of core business. For people like Volkswagen, I don't really know. Obviously, how can you, it's built locally. Yes, there's some subsidy from the local government and stuff, but I don't know how you can sell an ID3 at that price and make money. For the local brands, I think there's an interesting bigger picture that will play out over the next few years.
Well, I think we've just seen NIO announce a big round of job cuts, right? They are absolutely hemorrhaging cash on very low volumes. There is an enormous amount of overcapacity in the Chinese manufacturing base. And as we know, car factories only run efficiently when they're running at or close to capacity. Yeah.
I think this is why, as you can see, those brands coming to Europe, and they are really now looking to expand outside of China. I think there's big questions. I'm not an economist, but I think there's some big questions around what's happening with the Chinese economy, what's happening with the property market here, what's happening with people's disposable income. Can you continue to grow? As you said, can you churn a factory at full capacity? I think, and I'm not the first person to say it, we're probably heading for a bit of a crunch and a bit of a bloodbath around about 2025, 2026, where I think depending a bit on what happens with the global economy, how able some of these Chinese brands are to really push into Europe, how much the government is willing to stand behind and back some of them, I think it's almost certain that we'll see some of them fail or some level of consolidation. There will be successes. There will be global brands that are brands that are making money. BYD, Christ, just such a thing. The vertical integration, the ownership of the kind of battery construction model, and from sort of right through from mines to the cars, starting to work in Europe, making money, huge and impressive product line. The likes of BYD will be absolutely fine. And I think some of the better, more unique EV brands will make it. I hope NIO make it because I think they're doing a good job. I think Li Auto is another one to watch. If you don't know Li Auto, that's Li. Really impressive range of products, very kind of calm. They have a very interesting product coming in, a kind of new MPV called the Mega, which they claim to have many pre-orders for. It's an MPV. Looks wild. But the SUVs are a very... They could almost be from a Western brand, and the tech inside them is super, super impressive. Screens everywhere, but done in a really logical way to play to kind of kids. The whole use case was built around this idea of this kind of young family, the fact that they're going to be spending a lot of time, or the driver, the main owner, spending 2 or 3 hours a day in the car. To me, it's almost like this Scandinavian sort of equality to everybody in the car matters. Everybody gets an equal good experience. So it's not just about the guy behind the wheel mastering the vehicle and helm-smithing it round corners on the door handles. That's just BS. And this is really working. They're selling incredibly well. They're very well executed. I wish them very well. Design guys ex BMW I and Porsche. And I think they're a brand that will fly too. But some of the others, yeah, sure. I think they might hit the wall, and I think we're heading for a bit of a crunch. So it will be interesting to watch the next 3 or so years play out for everybody, Chinese brands and Western brands alike.
I think coming back to where we started off is a lovely way of wrapping up, because what you've described is a market and a consumer mindset that sits so distinctly from how we understand the evolution of the automotive industry in its current state in the West. And what you are doing there and what you're soaking up and the experiences that you're having, what you've relayed to us on this show, is so fundamentally important to being able to even have a point of view on that market, to let alone to be able to design for it, to be able to produce product for it. And it's very easy to think, oh, well, China is that thing over there. But actually, once you get there and you start to understand the differences in how consumers are relating to cars, it opens up vastly more opportunities to do interesting stuff. It is probably the most interesting market to design for,
Absolutely.
I would say.
Absolutely. You talk about kind of freedom in automotive design. The possibilities here are fascinating. And I think just to wrap on that point, my reflection is how much I think for us in the West and working for legacy brands that perhaps the pandemic has and will have come be seen to have a long-lasting impact. Because I've been so inspired by being here, and it's the first time I visited for 6 years, and I know I'm not the kind of example. Senior people from other brands have probably already visited by now, are seeing this. But for 2-3 years, none of us could. And I genuinely think that now that China's reopened, now that travel is possible again, it's super important that people start to come here again, start to see, start to soak up, start to understand and be inspired. And really, I often think that the Chinese design studios and R&D operations are used as like this kind of like satellite away from the kind of hubs, the main kind of motherships in places like Wolfsburg and Munich and Detroit. And I think the brands have really got to lean on them, because there's some really incredible people out here doing amazing work and that really understand this stuff and are really inspiring. And yeah, the world is changing. You can't do the same thing for here as you can that will work in Detroit and will work in London and will work in Munich, I don't think, anymore. I feel that those days of, the Chinese just doing copycat cars, if you believe that, come here and have a look, because wow, the car park is just, I'm like, what the hell's that? It's amazing.
It's nice to hear you excited about something, Joe.
Yeah, rather than
Very
being
nice to
hypercritical.
Hear you excited about. Exactly. Look, that's it for this 12th episode of Looking Out the podcast. Joe, it's been just so good to get this report from on the ground in Shanghai. If you've been watching and you like this show, please feel free to comment. We've been loving the comments. We're listening, we're reading, and
we're trying to react.
It's just so lovely to have you watching along with us. Do and subscribe to the show if you're watching on YouTube. Leave us a review if you're listening to this podcast. For more about the topics in this show, visit our website at lookingout.io, where you can also sign up for Looking Out, the newsletter. Looking Out, the podcast was written and presented by Drew Smith
and Joe Simpson.
This is Drew Smith, and thank you for listening. It was legs day. Like,
oh God, no!
I went 7 days this week. It was a bit much.
Did you? Fucking hell! Yeah. I'm doing well if I go 3 times.
We have children. It's different.
That's true.
I have a cat with an automatic feeder.